Hello. So today I wanted to talk about something called model and views. And this is a very cool feature in Qt. It exists in other UI systems as well, where you kind of separate the data from the way you look at the data. I'm just going to give a really quick introduction to how you could create a list editor right now. But I think there will be a couple of videos where I go through the various features that Qt has to offer about this, because one of the best features about models and views is that you can have, for example, a scene with a bunch of 3D data, like you would have in Maya, or a file browser with just a tree of items, and then you have a view that looks at this tree, and you have another view that looks at thumbnails, for example, but the data behind it is still the same file system. So you're not creating copies of the data with different representations. You're creating one data structure, and then that is completely independent of what UI you build on top of it. So you could even change what kind of UI you have. You could, instead of showing a tree of items, you could draw a node graph of how items are parented together or whatever. So you could really have multiple views of the same data. You can apply filters to those views. You can look at them in different ways, and yeah, just have different ways of representing one type of data, and you could make them editable. So when you edit in one view, the other view will show those changes as well without any effort from your side. I think this is a really powerful feature, and it's one of the Qt features that I use the most in daily life. So let's get started with making a very simple example. First, we do the usual of importing everything. Then we're going to create our application real quick. So this is just the boilerplate code that you need to run a standalone Qt application. And then the real code begins here, where I'm going to start with a window so we have something to look at. And I'll show that all the way at the end. And then that window needs a central widget. And then that central widget needs a layout. I should probably call this central layout instead. So this is kind of the boilerplate that you probably usually start out with. Might be a good idea to make a template out of this, so we don't have to write this every time, but I'm going to, so you can see me work, and maybe it helps you remember how stuff works if I just go through everything line by line. But here's the real meaty stuff. So Qt has various widgets and views, and the ones I'm not talking about today are called QStandard item model and QList view, for example. So you can make a model and fill it with data, and then you can look at it. But if you want something slightly simpler, there is the QList widget, which is kind of a wrapper around both of these concepts at the same time. So here we have a widget that represents a list, and you can edit it, you can move items around in it, you can grab the data, you can change the data. So this actually doesn't have that power of multiple views, one data, but it does have the convenience of, if you want one view with a list of data, everything you want to do with that list is here. All the features are there. So let me just create that view. And then, for example, let's fill it with some data. Let's create like red, green, and blue. And then we say view.add item. And then this needs a QList widget item with that value. So we just create a view, create an item, and we add the item to the view. And then, before I forget, we should add the view to the layout as well. And with all that done, I think we should see this guy pop up. Cool. So we have some items here. We can't do much with them, but we can look at them. So this is how you create a view and fill it with data. I think what's interesting next is that we can start editing this data. It's a little bit more involved than you might want it to be, because you need to set the item to be editable. So an item has flags, and there are some default flags, such as the fact that they are selectable and visible and all these stuff. So we want to get the existing flags first, because we need to keep these flags intact. And then we want to set the item set flags. So we cannot set one flag. We have to set all the flags. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna set the existing flags without like changing anything yet. So this is how you get the flags and set them. And in between here, we can modify them. So we're gonna add an additional flag called item is editable. And the way to do that is by using the pipe operator, pipe equals. And this just, what this does is it makes sure that this flag is set. If it was set already, nothing happens. If it's not set, then it will make sure that this flag is set. And you could write that in one line as well if you prefer to be a little bit shorter by doing it like this. But I'll split it up here so you can see the steps involved. You have to get the existing ones, change them, and then set them again. I think you can add the item whenever you want in this process, but just out of cleanliness, I set the properties of the item and then I add it to the view. Then to actually edit items to begin with, we have to set edit triggers to enabled as well. So on the view, there are many ways you can start editing an item. So we have items that are individually changeable or locked. But then we have our view, which just says, okay, but how can the user start changing items? So we can have something like double clicked. And that means if you double click an item, you can start changing the text. There's also edit key pressed, and here you can see that, wow, my keyboard did a weird thing there. Here you can see that pipe operator again, where we have multiple options and we combine them with this single pipe. Edit key pressed on Windows, that's F2. I'm not completely sure. I think on Mac it's like enter, and on Linux it's also F2. Or at least Ubuntu. So this is just kind of the operating system default edit key. So if you're using an edit key to change text, rename files, stuff like that, it will be that key, and it's kind of cross-platform like that. Then last, there is the any key pressed, which I also really like because you can click on an item and then start typing and it will immediately start changing the item, which I think is really cool. So with all this together, we should be able to launch our application, click on an item and just type capital R red, or we can double click and then we can change it. We can press F2 on Windows at least and change it as well. So that's how you can start editing these items. And I think that's a really nice thing where you can grab some data, display it, allow the user to change it. And then the next thing is, of course, we want to know what the user has done. So let's write some code to read back the items after they have been changed. And I'm going to do that after the application has executed. So when you close the window, there's like still some Python code that will run. Like this is blocked until all windows are closed. So after that, we can still do some logic like save a backup file or something, right? So we make sure that the user doesn't lose his changes. So to do that, we need to use a range over the number of items in our view. You do that by using count. So this will tell us how many items there are. And then for every index in that range, we can get the item. View.itemi.text. So we get the text of this item, and let's just display it. And when we run that and close it, it should print exactly what we have here. And if we change something like capital RED, it reflects that here as well. So the last thing I think we're showing is drag and drop. So this is really convenient, or at least I find so. So you have to set the drag and drop mode of a view because there's multiple things that can happen when you drag and drop. But what we want to do is we want to move stuff around. So that's called QListWidget.internal_move. So when we're dragging and dropping items, all we can do is move them inside of the view. We're not doing stuff like dragging it to another application or allowing you to draw something into the view. So that's also an option, right? Like you drag a file from your desktop into your widget. It detects that. It might show the file path in the list when you let go. That stuff we could talk about later, but for now, internal move is the most basic one. We also need to set drag to enabled. So dragging user input is enabled, and this is what happens with that user input. You need to set both of those things. And we could really just swap this list around now and close it, and you can see that that reorder has been reflected as well. And these are independent of each other as well. So if you have a UI where you want the user to prioritize something, you don't have editing enabled, but you do have dragging enabled, and they could just move the items in a specific order, and you could read back the order. that the user created. So that's it for a very brief introduction to Qt views and how you can edit data with them. Next time, I will downgrade, I guess, from the widget to the QList view. And then we have to create our own QStandard item model and our own QStandard items instead of QList widget items. But what that gives us is a little bit more control over where our data goes. And that's where really the incredibly rich feature set that Qt has starts to open up, because we can start doing things called proxy models. You can sort data, you can filter data, you can make search fields, you can do all kinds of really cool stuff with that. So more on that later. Thanks for watching.